There's somebody. Let's...
He was your son. A note dropped from the sky near the Frisbee's home. Cynthia found it, a piece of paper folded neatly and tied with string to a small flat stone. The courier bird had been accurate. The packet had landed only a few feet from the entrance hole. Still, the sender had neatly printed an address on it, just in case. Mrs. Jonathan Frisbee, Cinderblock House, Fitzgibbons Garden. Cynthia did not open the letter, but she was very excited. She carried it to her mother, who was down by the brook washing some bits of potato. "Mother," she shrieked, "we got a letter!" She waved the little parcel in the air. Open it right away!" Mrs. Frisbee examined the packet carefully. She had little doubt where it had come from. The rats were the only animals she knew, besides her own family and Mr. Age's, who could read and write. But she suspected that they would not send her a message by air except in an emergency. Her paws shook a little as she untied the package and unfolded the letter. The message was written in a neat script in lavender ink that smelled like pokeberries. "Dear Mrs. Frisbee, your son Timothy has not arrived for school as expected. If he will not be coming, please place a white stone 1 foot north of the entrance hole to your home. Otherwise, we will search for him. Sincerely, Justin." "Who sent it? What does it say?" Cynthia asked, but when she saw her mother's downcast expression, she quieted. "What is it, Mother?" "Timothy hasn't arrived at Thorn Valley," Mrs. Frisbee said. She tried to keep her voice calm, but there were tears in her eyes. "What day was he supposed to get there?" Cynthia asked. She counted on her whiskers. "He left 5 days ago, so he should have arrived yesterday. But, Mother, they didn't know that he was coming on foot. And you know Timothy can dawdle." "That's true," Mrs. Frisbee said, though she did not really believe it. "He'll get there," Cynthia said stubbornly. Mrs. Frisbee could see that her daughter was also fighting back tears. "Of course she will," she said, forcing a smile. "Let's not think about it until we get further news." And they agreed they would not. But that evening a strange crow flew down from the sky and arrived at Mrs. Frisbee's doorstep. He croaked twice, and when Mrs. Frisbee appeared, he gestured toward his back. "Who are you?" Mrs. Frisbee asked. The crow looked at her, but did not answer. She tried again, this time adding a note of false authority to her voice. "Who are you? Why are you here?" Again, the crow refused to speak, but merely gestured to his back. Mrs. Frisbee felt sure that the crow had something to do with Timothy. She went back into the house, wrapped her shawl around her, and told the children that she had to run an errand. Then, resolving to think of Timothy alive and well, she climbed onto the strange crow's back. The crow rose in the air and flew quickly over the farmer's field and above the forest. Mrs. Frisbee did not open her eyes or look down. She had no idea in what direction he was flying or how long they had been in the air before he suddenly banked and descended, landing on the branch of a hollow tree. Mrs. Frisbee looked around. She was surrounded by pine woods. Directly in front of her was the trunk of the tree, which seemed to her as wide as the side of a house, and on it a dark, plate-shaped opening, the owl's door. She climbed down. She had been here once before, 3 years earlier, to ask the owl's advice when Timothy was sick and could not be moved from the Cinderblock House before plowing time. The owl had listened to her then and had sent her to the rats for help. But she had felt terrified in his presence, for he was known among the animals as a fierce hunter and the wisest of all the creatures who lived in the meadows and woods. She went to the edge of the opening and looked inside. He was there, huge and terrible as he had been before, his yellow eyes shining through the dark. "Come in," he said. His voice sounded like trees creaking in the wind. Mrs. Frisbee stepped into the hollow room. She saw dimly the cavernous shapes of the dark chamber, which reminded her of a vast tomb. Pieces of broken wood formed a sort of walkway back toward the owl's nest where he was standing. Mrs. Frisbee picked her way along this jagged bridge until she stood within a foot of the owl's great head. "Mrs. Frisbee," the owl's voice was very deep and very sad, "you may wonder why I have sent for you." "Yes," she said. She was trembling. "I have sent for you," the owl began. But then he appeared to choke, and he began again. "I have sent for you because I believe that I have killed your son." So that was it. For a moment, Mrs. Frisbee thought that she was falling into the darkness, but later she realized that her feet were on the wooden pathway and that she was still standing in the owl's chamber. She felt the tears flowing down her face. "2 nights ago," the owl continued, "I went out hunting in North Woods, where the river splits. I was hungry, and I saw 2 rodents on the path in the moonlight. I dove for the larger, a small rat, but the smaller one rushed to protect him. I picked him up, and he shouted his name." Here the owl paused. "Timothy Frisbee," he said gently. "He was your son, was he not?" Mrs. Frisbee was overcome by grief. She nodded her head. "I dropped him when I realized who he was," the owl said, "but I had grabbed him with my talons, and I am afraid that I pierced his heart." There was silence in the chamber for a long time. Mrs. Frisbee tried to hold her sobs deep in her throat. She could not speak. "He died a hero, like his father," the owl said. "That may be some comfort to you." Again there was silence. A wind blew, and the dead limbs of the tree rattled like drumbeats. The old tree shook as if it would fly apart. Suddenly, Mrs. Frisbee realized she was no longer afraid. She felt as if she had lost all her strength to fight, to work, even to fear. The owl leaned down. "You have other children," he said gently. "You must go home to them. You must prepare to make a long journey away from this country. Men with great machines are working at the north end of Thorn Valley. They are destroying the mountain there, and they plan to destroy the woods and farms as well." Mrs. Frisbee nodded, but it was hard for her to listen to the owl. What good was his warning now? Timothy was dead. That was all that mattered. "I killed your son because I had to eat," the owl said. "There was a reason. With men, it often seems that there is no reason at all." "Money," Mrs. Frisbee said softly. She felt numb. "I have heard it said that men do what they do for pieces of paper called money." The owl shook his great head as if in puzzlement or sorrow. He turned his face toward the wall and did not speak again. Mrs. Frisbee did not say goodbye, but made her way slowly out to where the crow was waiting. She climbed onto his back. "Fly north, fly to the north woods, along the river," she told him. "Fly close to the ground, where there is a path. I'm looking for someone there." The crow's voice was low and rasping. "It is nearly dark." "There will be moonlight," Mrs. Frisbee said. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and spoke as if she were in the habit of commanding crows. Hurry! There's no time to lose. The struggle. The first thing that Timothy was aware of was the cold. Before he could speak, even before he could think a complete thought, he felt the cold. It seemed to come from inside his body rather than from the air outside, and the various layers he could feel piled over him for warmth did not affect it. Sometimes his entire body would tremble, and after that he would feel a little better. Later, he heard a voice. He was sure that it was not his mother. The voice would say his name over and over in a sad, pleading tone. Timothy! 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 The voice would come into his mind and hold his attention for a very brief while, like the flickering flame of a candle. It was hard to listen. It was easier to sink back into the darkness. But it seemed that the voice could rescue him from the cold. For that reason, it was important to try to listen to it and to hear what it was saying. Each time the voice came, Timothy struggled to hear it and to keep it in his mind. Someone is talking. Someone is talking to me. He had many dreams. He dreamed that his mother was with him and that she was speaking to him and saying his name. He dreamed that she put her paw upon his head and that she gave him soup. He dreamed about Thorn Valley. He dreamed that the school had opened and that the rats had failed to notice that he was missing. He could see Arthur standing at the front of the classroom, pointing to a diagram on the blackboard. His friends, Brendan, Sally, and Isabella, were in their seats. Racso was sitting in a desk in the front row. He could see his own desk. It was empty. He dreamed that he had died. He dreamed that his mind left his body and rose in the air and could fly. He could not fly as high or as fast as Jeremy, but by continued effort, he could drift in whatever direction he wanted. He flew slowly above the trail in the forest. He saw birds and animals, but they could not see him. For a moment, he thought that he would turn around and fly back toward his winter home in the cinder block. But he continued to drift, like a small, loose ship on a calm sea. The day he opened his eyes was the first day he felt the pain. He looked up and saw Racso's face looking down into his. "You're alive," Racso said, his eyes filled with tears. After that, the memories were mercifully jumbled. He remembered the rat pouring water into his mouth. Another time he woke up and tasted chocolate in his mouth and realized that Racso had been feeding him. Once he woke up and thought that he was alone, but when he turned his head slightly, he saw the rat sitting there beside him. There was a horrible pain in his chest and shoulder. He did not have to move to feel it. He felt it all the time he was awake and sometimes now when he was sleeping. The pain throbbed, and sometimes it seemed to squeeze his entire body like a gigantic hand that was bent on crushing him. At those times he felt like screaming. One time when he woke up, his head felt clearer. He saw Racso sitting beside him, and he spoke his name. The rat turned to him quickly and smiled. That night, Timothy was aware of being fed, and he tried to swallow as much as he could so that he would get stronger. When he woke up the next morning, he remembered what had happened. They had been walking at night and had been attacked by an owl. The owl had grabbed him with its talons. The memory ended there. He wondered why he was still alive. "What day is this?" he asked. Racso explained that after the accident he had dragged Timothy off the trail onto a small shelf of rocks in the side of a dry gully. The shelf was covered with leaves but bordered with rock on two sides, so that it broke the wind and hid them from view. He told Timothy they had been on the shelf for 3 full days. "How much food is left?" "Don't worry about that," Racso said bravely, but Timothy thought that he looked a little scared. That evening, Racso brought Timothy small portions of beans and chocolate. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to find a willow tree. Tomorrow morning, I want you to find a willow tree, Timothy told him. They grow along the river. Willow bark relieves pain. I don't think I can recognize a willow tree, Racso said. I'll describe it, and you can take my knife to cut the bark off. Won't you be frightened if I leave you? Yes, Timothy said, but I want you to go. The sooner I feel better, the sooner we will be able to leave. Later that night, Timothy awoke to find himself covered with leaves. Racso was nestled close beside him. When he felt Timothy stir, he whispered, Don't move. There's a big bird flying back and forth over the path. I covered us both up with leaves so it couldn't see us. It's flown past again and again, as if it were searching for someone. Someone to eat, Timothy said grimly. It's calling somebody, Racso said. And the funny part is, its voice doesn't sound like a bird, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. Timothy wondered. Could it be the owl returning for his prey? Owls had been known to trick all but the most cautious mice. He shivered in his bed of leaves. We must stay hidden, he told Racso, and before long he fell back to sleep. The next morning, Racso set off with the description of the willow bark and Timothy's small knife. In an hour he was back, bringing with him a variety of barks. Timothy recognized one as the willow bark he needed. He broke off a small bit and chewed it. Almost immediately he fell back to sleep and slept for several hours. When he awoke, he felt better. It's dangerous for us to camp here day after day, he told Racso. We're certain to be noticed by other animals, and not all of them are friendly. That night, Racso brought Timothy a meal of ground oats. Timothy noticed that the rat did not eat anything at all. When he mentioned it, Racso said, I ate earlier, but he looked tired. Timothy decided that they should try to leave the next day. He chewed more of the willow bark and fell asleep. He slept deeply without dreaming. Racso slept close beside him. When he awoke, Racso was still asleep. Timothy rolled onto his stomach, gathered his hind legs under his body, then tried to ease a little weight onto his front legs. He was seized with pain. He clenched his teeth to keep from crying out. He tried again. Again, the pain was agonizing, and he slipped back down onto his stomach. He knew now that it would be some time before he would be able to walk. He was filled with anger. How had he gotten into this situation? It was all Racso's fault. He remembered the day he had left on his trip to Thorn Valley, how happy he had been. Life had seemed simple before he had met Racso. All he had wanted was to get to school on time. He looked at Racso on the ground, breathing peacefully. He felt like hurting the rat, yet he knew he would have died without Racso's help. Angry tears welled up in Timothy's eyes. Racso woke up. He looked at Timothy's position on the ground and guessed what had happened. You tried to walk? Timothy nodded. He tried to control his tears, but he could not. Racso moved over beside him and touched his shoulder. Don't cry, Timothy, he said. I got you into this mess, and I'm going to get you out of it. I've already decided what to do. I'm going to build a sling and pull you along the trail. I'll get you to Thorn Valley if it's the last thing I ever do. Reunion. As Timothy's strength increased, Racso became less worried about him, and the rat grew cocky, as he had been when he and Timothy first met. Just leave it all to me, he told Timothy cheerfully. Last year I snuck around behind the baseboard at the movie theater and saw a show about how to live in the woods. It was called The Last of the Mohicans. There was an Indian in the movie who was kind of short for his age and looked a lot like me, and he made a sling to move his wounded friend. Animals who live in the wild have certain rules about how to act in the woods, Timothy said. I've been thinking that it would be useful to review them with you. I probably know them already, Racso said, but you can tell me if it will make you feel better. The first one is always cover up your trail. Racso shrugged as if the idea were nothing new. Of course, he said. I just happen to like to flip my tail around. That's all. I could tell where you'd walked, Timothy said. That means an enemy could too. Racso pulled his hat down over his ears and didn't say anything. The second rule is this, Timothy said. If you hear something coming, even from far away, take cover. I hid us from that bird the other night, didn't I? Racso chuckled. And that bird was looking for someone. Even in the dark, I could tell that. It flew back and forth over the path, again and again. Timothy stared, troubled and uncertain. What if that bird had not been the owl, as he had suspected? He thought of Jeremy, but no, Jeremy was at his mother's. And anyway, how could he have known that Timothy was in trouble? The whole thing was probably just Racso's imagination, and it was up to him to bring Racso down to earth. He shook his head in disgust. Here's another rule, he said gruffly. Never light a fire in the woods. Now Racso was ready to argue. The Indians did? We're not Indians, Timothy said. Anyway, they were careful. They knew how to make a fire without setting the woods on fire. So do I, Racso said defensively. I toasted marshmallows the night before I met you. I melted chocolate squares right in the middle of the marshmallow. The Girl Scouts do that, you know. It's a famous dessert. Racso! Timothy felt totally exasperated. I put that fire out myself the next morning. You could have burned the whole forest down and killed us both. Racso looked surprised and then concerned. You'd better rest now, he suggested. You're getting upset over nothing, Timothy. He smiled beneficently. And if there's one thing we don't need right now, it's a worried little field mouse. Racso spent all morning working on the sling. He used Timothy's knife to cut and trim 2 4-inch sticks. He stretched Timothy's jacket between the 2 sticks, buttoned it, and ran the sticks through the coat sleeves. He fastened the sleeves to the body of the jacket with string, and wove the string back and forth under the jacket like a hammock. After that, he used another string to fashion a simple harness for himself. Wrap the ends of this around your paws a couple of times so that it can't slip out, he told Timothy, handing him the traces of the harness. When you're ready, I'll get up on all fours and run up the bank as quickly as I can. It may hurt, but at least it should be over with fast. Timothy did as he was told. He felt pain, but he held on, realizing that the worst would soon be over. Still, when they reached the trail, he felt faint and sick to his stomach. He lay still for a long time. Racso fed him a portion of oats. Timothy could see that the corn husk wrapper in which the oats had been packed was now empty. He chewed some willow bark and drank a bit of water. He lay back on the sling and tried to rest. Racso fastened the knapsack to the sticks just under Timothy's hind feet. We're ready to go, he said. Where's the paper bag? Timothy asked. It's empty, Racso said, looking away. He fitted the 2 sticks onto loops in the string and began to pull. The sticks slid over the ground easily. Timothy lay back and tried to relax. Although his chest and shoulder throbbed, he could lie quietly in the sling as it moved, and the ride over the path was quite smooth. Racso pulled Timothy along the trail for almost an hour. Although the sun was behind a cloud, the day was warm, and Racso's fur was slick with sweat. "I have to rest a while," he told Timothy. He sat down and drank some water. He looked hesitantly at Timothy. "Did you once mention that your family ate acorns?" He said the last word with a grimace, as if it offended him. Timothy spotted an oak tree and pointed to it. "Look under there," he said. "There'll be hundreds of acorns on the ground. Bring me a couple, and I'll show you how to eat them." Racso searched under the tree and returned with 2 large acorns. One of them was already cracked. Timothy pulled it apart and took out the juicy inner kernel. He ate a little bit himself and then handed the rest to Racso. Racso took a huge bite and chewed briefly, but instead of swallowing the acorn, he spit it out on the ground. "It's bitter," he complained. Then, sadly, he took another bite, gulping hurriedly. He ate bite after bite. "I like berries," he said when he had finished the entire nut. "But I don't like acorns." They traveled for another hour. The ground was still quite smooth, and the fallen leaves cushioned the bumps. Timothy felt tired, but the sound of the river flowing nearby was soothing. Still, he worried about Racso. He suspected that the rat had not had enough food to eat for several days, and it was clear that the store of provisions they had brought with them was almost exhausted. Suddenly, Racso gave a whoop. He turned around to Timothy with a smile. "We've reached the spot where the river splits," he said. "I can see a large stream flowing off to the left." The sling was too low to the ground for Timothy to see, but he was pleased. The trail turned north, and they followed it. It began to get dark. They decided to sleep in the midst of a large honeysuckle thicket. Racso divided the curtain of vines enough to slip the sling through it into an open central room. It was quite dark, but airy and dry, with a faint sweet odor of rotted honeysuckle blooms. "I'm hungry," Racso said sadly. "Is there any food left in the knapsack?" "It's for you." Timothy opened the knapsack and looked inside. He found a packet with 2 beans in it and a small square of chocolate. Timothy ate one of the beans and offered the candy to Racso. "You eat it," Racso said. "I like the beans just as much." Racso hesitated. "Here," Timothy said, handing him the chocolate, and the rat gobbled it down gratefully. In the morning, they shared the last bean in the knapsack and headed north. The leaves swirled around Timothy, and occasionally Racso batted them higher into the air with his tail. Suddenly, Racso stopped stock still. "I thought I heard something," he whispered. Timothy listened too. Sure enough, from someplace far ahead on the path there came a slight rustling noise. Was it the wind? Timothy could not be sure. "Let's hide," Racso said. He pulled the sling to a sheltered spot behind the trunk of a large pine tree and crouched down. The rustling continued and grew louder. Racso peeped out from behind the tree. "I don't see anything," he told Timothy. "Shh," Timothy said. The rustling grew louder still. The rat peeked out again. Timothy saw his body grow stiff with excitement. "What is it, Racso?" he whispered. "What do you see?" "Rats," Racso whispered. His voice was trembling. "4 large rats." Timothy's eyes grew wide. "What do they look like? Lift me up so I can see." Racso lifted the sling so that it leaned against the tree trunk like a short ladder. Timothy craned his neck. Still, he could not see the rats. "More, more," he whispered, and Racso leaned the sling a little farther to one side. The rats were standing in a circle on the path, about 40 feet to the north of the pine tree. They were talking, but Timothy could not see their faces. Then suddenly the leader moved so that he was facing the tree. "Justin!" Timothy whispered to himself, and then he yelled, "Justin!" Racso panicked. "Timothy, be quiet! What are you doing?" "Justin!" Timothy yelled again, joyfully. The rat looked toward the tree. Then he began to run. "He's coming right this way," Racso groaned. "Justin!" Timothy shouted. "Take cover!" Racso yelled. "He's going to kill us both." Just at that moment, the rat burst from behind the tree. Racso threw himself face down on the ground, covered his head with his paws, and curled up into a ball. "Justin!" shouted Timothy. "Timothy!" the large rat said. He embraced the mouse and signaled the other rats to come. "Thank goodness," he said. "We've found you at last."